And then we can probably unplug this. Oh, right.
What? Yeah, I put it there this morning. Where was it? I found it down. This is, you know, he said he'd left his bag here and then we couldn't find it in the car.
Double the wind.
Down though, so hanging on the rail of the stairs, so I put it on your chair this morning. Because I was like, oh, I've seen it surely before now. I didn't look, but I heard about the level there. Yeah, it was
No, it just comes here.
yes, so now I can say it's here. It's always funny when you hear something. Yeah, it is, isn't it? Red. That's good. What time is it? All day. Yeah, I'll close that and get it done. On the floating barge.
I went to like Luna Park and they had a 3D thing with everything, and everything was happening over top of it. I just had to sit down on the ground. It's like you know, room standing, and I just had to sit down on the ground. It got so easy.
Start with the heart suture.
Right, start with the Heart Sutra. Listening here at one time, the Bhagavan was dwelling in the mountains and branching mountain and branch branching amongst in a great community of Bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was involved in the concentration phenomena called fine perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasatva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very front of the action of wisdom. Those 5 ideas also is empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Conscious said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasatva Arya Avalokiteshvara. How should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that when the Bodhisattva Mahasatva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Buddha, any son of the lineage of the lineage to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon like this correctly and repeatedly, beholding those 5 ideas also as empty of their nature. All is empty, emptiness is found, emptiness is not all is also none other than emptiness. In the same way, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra likewise all phenomena
entities without characteristic unproduced,
unceased stainless, not without stains, by definition not fulfilled.
Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no composition factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no vision, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon.
There is no I element in soul, not
including
no mind element in the mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance in soul, no aging in death, no extinction of aging in death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and heart. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and no Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, Bodhisattvas rely on the divine perfection of wisdom, without obscuration, without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, deity, and point of no all the Buddhas who dwell in three times also manifestly completely awakened to unsurpassable, perfect, and complete enlightenment in the lies on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the nature of the perfection of wisdom, the nature of the great good to the unsurpassable, the nature equal to the unequal, the nature that thoroughly satisfies all suffering should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata Om Gati Anagati Anasamgati Bodhisattva. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Master should train the perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Master Ayaka saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that, it is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you indicated, even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Shariputra Bodhisattva Mahasattva Ayaka, and those surrounding in their entirety along the world of gods, humans, and souls and the others, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. I prostrate in gathering of the deities in the three chakras who abide in holy yoga fusing space. By your powers, great wise and magical emanation, look after the practitioners like a mother. Tayata Om Gati Gati Bhagavate Samgati Bodhisattva. By the teachings of the three supreme Lords, possessors of power of truth, may ignorant and outer ignorance be transformed, may they be dispelled, may they be pacified, sheathed in the glory of soul. May all negative forces opposed to Dharma be completely pacified. May the host of 80,000 hospitals be pacified. May we be separated from harmless and harmful conditions to Dharma, and may all enjoyments be in accordance with Dharma. May there be auspiciousness and perfect the right now. Mandala offering. Saji Perkichuchi Metojan, Viran Shingi Pimpadi, Sanjay Shindri Hawaii,
Sangye Chedan Choju Jongwa Chancho Wadu Dami Kelsuchi Dami Chichi Besama Rola Penche Sangye Jongwa Sho Sangye Chedan Choju Jongwa Chancho Wadu Dami Kelsuchi Dami Chichi Besama Rola Penche Sangye Jongwa Sho Sangye Chedan Choju Jongwa Chancho Wadu Dami Kelsuchi Dagi Chichi Gibe Songi Dra Sangi Drupara Sho Kanki Tuzini Zone Tawa Tamji Pambi Chere Tambi Chun Tenzi Kodam Kela Chance Lo Good morning. 참다 개월에 찌직된 교민이 따봤네 진짜 땡진 좀 봤네 깨지지게 무서워 나기 인가 가지고 대대리가 소수 딱 세트
In picking up from where we left off yesterday, let's just look at where we are in the text. So we're looking at the way to train in the conduct of guarding the mind by means of mindfulness and introspection, the way to train in ethics of refraining from negative actions. We started with making effort to purify the conduct of the three doors. We've covered the first point, which is examining the conduct of body and speech. And now we are looking at examining the conduct of the mind. Today we're going to pick up from the second point, which is examining whether or not the mind is one pointed in virtue in verse 41. Verse 41 reads, however, I strive in concentration. I should not let loose for even one moment. What does this mind of mine do? I ask. Analyze the mind in detail in this regard.
일단 가정한 되는 건데 지금 최세로 시대로 이내야 다조디 샘디 게비 미발이야 아니 존주 또기 되는 깨지 지냐 셴드 마요와 네바 체고레스 더드닝 도문도 아니 소소소 이거야 딱지치치 네가 문도나 아니 존주 또기 진다 아니 네바 체고레스
So stemming out from this point, there is a discussion with respect to developing the single pointedness of mind using effort, choice effort, that does not allow the mind to stray away from the object even for one moment. So that is done through the power of choice effort.
당간저 깨지찌게 마요 세위설이야 깨지찌게 마듯니 요거를 세위설 신간저 샘든저 베나가다가다 샘이야 기미발이야 깨지게 마듯니 셴의 로고를 세위설지 차대도스라
By the power of effort, not allowing the mind to stray away even for one moment from the object, from the focal object. But how does it work for us? It seems that for us, rather than doing that, it's the opposite. Not allowing the mind to stay even for one moment on the object, and through effort, or through the lack of which, the mind wanders off. At least Geshe said that for him, this is often the case, that not staying on the object, even for one moment, and the mind being wandering off.
제 상담 쳐다지 월답이나 미즈만도 당 아니 제rum치 고소투게 이 연대 비기라 다치 템바치치네 아니 비기라야 가서 다치 미바 셴라야 마양바 샘 셴라 마양바 다가라네 미바 때니 베나 미즈만 친구지 다양라야 다 배시 드라마틱 소리지 마도 내가 비키는 문도 쓰라.
So it's good to check it out, to assess our ability to do so. Like, for example, in the recitation of Mixema, in focusing on the qualities of body, speech, and mind of the great master Lama Tsongkhapa, and not allowing the mind to stray away to other objects, remaining on the qualities of body, speech, and mind of Lama Tsongkhapa while reciting Mixema. How hard it is when you start to assess that, right? So you pay attention to your recitation and assess what is your ability to remain single pointed without the mind wandering off. You get a sense of how hard it is.
일단 이내야 샘슈로지 지금 괜히 용사 말했으면 샘슈로지 잘못 앉으시는 자금원에서 가능스나 이 검지지 때는다 용그라 삼삼로지 베나 야스쇼도 소만한지 검나 라우면 용어도 간 요만 세디 and similarly you chip them usra.
And yet Geshe does not despair. He doesn't think that it is impossible, it will never happen. Single pointedness of mind without the mind wandering off will never be there. Geshe does not despair, because just as Shantideva said, there is nothing that does not become easier through familiarity. So if you do develop habits, if you accustom yourself to that single pointness of mind, it will happen.
데레다 안딘장 안주 좀주 dobgechini 단다 좀주 잠비 좀주기 땡들레로 만지시 땡 dobden 땡빌려서 이 좀주 바로 천조 쇼스 여러분 지금 마무송도 왔어 좀주 dobge치 좀주 좀치 아니 수주기 따지 다니엘 니비 레로다 아니 자원이 신기 레로다 소바 도네 아니 좀주 파르듯이 제거를 세디 마무스 코데인자 리아 삼삼르치라.
So that will be made possible by the power of effort, joyous effort, which is just like one of the verses Arizona sometimes recites in seeking the blessings to develop joyous effort that will overcome the different types of laziness of discouragement in which we look down on ourselves, laziness of being attracted to ignoble activities and so forth. All of that will be made possible through the power of effort.
ngi namji di tsik di chunju gi tsik resang di doi tsik re da di kazangan zu pyo daman lo di tinandu
Tandade Kanandre.
sanji songrang re shas.
So Geshe recited that verse, and he assumed before that this verse is taken from Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva Way of Life. But a few days ago, during the weekend, Geshe was asked to do some recitation of sutras in one household belonging to a Sikkimese family. And he came across that verse in the sutra that he was reciting. So it's not a verse of Shantideva, it's actually something that was taught by the Buddha.
Then true to that. Nge konzola kanju chanzan loya kelen chi isra. Nge kazan domang lo wandi nge kanju chanzan ji lo tnanga lo gepe yong sare samsung rachi. Konjo source isra. Nge konzola kanju chanzan loya 당이 가득 살고 있는 것이 간지 캘린치 있으라.
So a request was previously made to Geshe to recite the whole set of the Kangyur, the 100 and something volumes of the teachings that the Buddha gave. So it takes obviously a lot of time, and Geshe during the weekend had the chance to read only one part of one of the volumes. So he made a commitment at that point to, at some point, get through the whole of the Kangyur, because in looking at the things that he did manage to read during the weekend, actually you get quite a lot to think of, and there's quite a lot to be gained when you read the sutra. So how long will it take, and whether he will indeed manage to, he will indeed manage to get the whole reading done, and how long will it take him? Geshe is not sure, but he's committed to do that at one point.
단다 도 튼동치 단다 파바 준신 도 세지 파바 준신 도 될이야 숑 신치마도 문도 쇼 디진도 쇼 원쇼 심마도 문도 딩이 빠르게 키워 딩이 참츠 카버나 이돌아 빠비스 이돌이 빠비라 단 남중한 로종 치고라 되는 로종 야슬랑의 소드마 젠다 아니지 로종 천장콜로 자비기다 쇼야부여러스 이네 산지랑기 송 로종 아니베 가서 signiño 아니 된다 고대고 사부 야부 쇼지 인들이 제선스 딩이 계율라 퓨지 인스톨 균 캔슬 직점 투야 레워치고스라 tundomberes chorumberes
So Geshe came across this sutra during his recitation. So Geshe was reading one volume, and it consisted of actually a few sutras, quite a few sutras. So one of them was a sutra that was composed by, sutra of Arya Junshing. I don't know what the name is. Junshing is a word in Tibetan. I don't know what the term for that is in Sanskrit. But anyway, the sutra was quite short, only 4 pages of text. And Geshe took a photo of the sutra with his text and then typed the whole sutra on his phone, right? So the sutra is a mind training sutra. So we do study other texts for mind training, the 37 practices of Bodhisattvas, the will of sharp weapons. But actually, when you look at mind training stuff we taught by the Buddha, at least this text, this sutra, was so easy to understand and had such a practical approach to the practice of mind training. So Geshe said that he tapped it on his phone and maybe a translator, one translator, I don't know who the person is, will translate it in the future into English. I was rolling my inner eyes when I heard that.
And maybe in the future, Geshe will be able to teach us.
Jamala Kanan did in the
인지도 주로 지난게 손주를 샤신나라시는 게 뜻이 저랬어. 벤이지어졌어.
well, if it is translated in the future into English, then you might be able to do it. But we have actually a couple of people that study in Tibetan at the moment. This is how you pass the envelope. Yeah. Talk to me in a couple of years.
예. 근데 디나마를 따지단기 송강마부슈지. 라. 송강마부슈도 디나니 베나다지 게츠롱기 아니 동바용인 쪽이 아니 지 베나다지 동안 참모다 아니 딘딜라 소베다 지 동비면도 그원이 따디 타바지야나 지당한도 소종 초고라스 딘디기 니바타이 체도 아니 다야게 nga tindian dus ro nge di gonda de nge mang tha ji dai ba nge nga chana monde chawro ra mang tha ji dai ba and dani nge di gonda de ya kunju ti hagan na la ya nga ju geshi da da yo ba chi manam chi tang sons ti nyam de nga chokpo ji geshi sunum sam se ji bele ye nga ni nyam de tu de ra nga ni nyam de tu di ge nga ju ta chi cha ga so ro ji 차지고 참면이 미산 샴발라야 잘롱가 drogo 세트랑이 그 센다 안롱가 dro는 카드 못 사이로 지글라더라 이 카르어서 간주 게노로 왔어 잘롱은 카르어스 라기다 니디 오늘 타네기디 내가티 펜도여서라 삼성르지 나는 남도 딘디 샤송스
So in doing this recitation of the text, it was a really thick volume. As I said, it consisted of quite a few sutras, and in many of them there were dharanis, which means those long mantras that Geshe was reciting while doing his readings. Right? Many of the sutras also include dharanis, those mantra formulations. So one of those dharani mantras was used for purification of downfalls, negativities and downfalls that were incurred with respect to one's ordination vow, either as a novice or fully ordained. So we use such recitation of dharanis, for example, when we purify downfalls, like for example, through purification of downfalls that is done in the practice of sojong. Anyway, so Geshe read through those sutras and he came across those dharanis, those mantra formula. And Geshe said that him being a bit a person of blind faith, he thought that this is really helpful. So in the evening, he did quite a lot of repetition of this mantra. And following that, he had a dream with him after going to sleep. So he was dreaming of hanging out with his Geshe friends. One of them is named one of them's name is Sonam Sangbo. Went back to Tibet, and Geshe was dreaming that was hanging out with his Geshe. And there were, at some point they wanted to have a cup of tea, but they had no they had no tea. So Geshe said, just let's go out and, beg for tea. And his friend, Geshe Sonam, said, what do you mean beg for tea? Like, we can't really do that. And Geshe said that, of course we can do that. We are gelongs, we are fully ordained. Fully ordained people can go out and beg for tea. Anyway, it's a nice story, isn't it?
Teresa, Java Dinaloya. Dinang Domon, Nengaters, Tangaran Toman, Sawa de Bio, it's some Parjamba, Kawana Parjan, in Keynes, Peninja, then yet in the Ganju Chance, Lot to an agenda. Tilling it job shoes in Pixel to the younger letters party. Job shoes that you do good and petty. The cheese. In a Ganju Chance, Lot, and one Tanis that. Sozula, Logi Shuchik, Ragi over the Yatamba.
So when Geshe was doing that recitation of this text, he wanted to complete at least, if not the whole text, then a major part of it. So he had to do a quick recitation. So when you recite quickly, you don't really get to think a lot about what you're reading. But there were a few occasions when Geshe took it easy and looked at different sections of the sutra and says that actually there's quite a lot that you can work with. You can really expand your mind, get some advice from the sutra. So it made him even more enthused and determined to, in the future, to take the time to read through all the volumes of the Kangyur. So as he was doing those readings and came across some points that he thought are really helpful and valuable, he also took photos of those relevant sections.
That Dagi and Devinamaya, Dagi Chini can give each other some and they give each other Mayan be things in the Zumbani, Kichi Chigan, Tele Shendu Mucho Chedi, Dagi Yinde, Chawada Chawa Mayimbi, Cha Kachichi, Tedder Yila Yam the Yondu.
Let's look at the commentary to verse 41. It says, I shall not even for one moment lose my concentration on the virtuous objects and be distracted to something else. Analyze your mind repeatedly, saying, this mind of mine does suitable and unsuitable actions.
That's Sumbananga Chavi Kapshavas. The Chidangi Sanji Sonlaya, Namanta, Kawasing, Hardun de, and in Dushonlaya, and in Nangaki Chavamambuchik, Yunguyoras, Tichidigi, Tangan do stay on the gay. Sanji Namayo de Jutuso, Lamsan Shin de Jurochik, and Pena, Takarina, Chidokaza Sayala Sobare, the Nichik Neba in a chick, any color such a Sobare, any child and any Chigurata, now you're in Doki, Chawadi, Betty, and Tammy Shin de Euros, Lalan Target de Euros, Redos, that Galbi, Gaja Chimbugon, Gasha, you to Samalo, and Gabgolayachi, Shinaya, and Rayan Tan Shabatan, and Shinaya machine don't chechi, you shall soba. Kanji, Gashabadi, Tam the shoes, language. Now you read the now you heard that in show Taminchi de Euro. Then it's how does the
next point is explaining the context for permitted and prohibited actions. So when you read through the sutra set of teachings, the scriptural text, you find a lot of references to things that you can do, that you're allowed to do, and things that are prohibited. And often our attitude with respect to that is that we become experts with respect to the things that we are allowed to do, certain permissions to do things. Like, for example, if you're ordained, then you become skilled in finding the permissions for eating food afternoon and in the evening, or finding permissions to do different things if you're sick, or when you're doing prostrations and so forth, finding permissions to take it easy, to kind of find ways to make it easier on you. But with respect to the prohibition, we either ignore the things that are prohibited, or we prefer not to know, or we kind of prefer to remain a bit vague and obscure with respect to them. So it is good to look at our attitude with respect to the things that are prohibited and the things that we can do, that are allowed, and to look at what is our mental attitude with respect to them.
Terdinza chitang ani chitang ka ani gagul tuni nawa song shawata yungu yoros. The di kalaya gasha da goba ning nani gasha goba chungu yona ani ka shawatlia name toni ani che choyach. Disungores, ditagores ra.
There are actions that are prohibited, and yet in certain situations there is a need to do that prohibited action, and therefore you have a permission to do it in those particular situations. So we need to weigh up certain situations, to weigh up the prohibition and the necessity of doing that action. If the necessity outweighs the prohibition, then you're permitted to do that action. So this is something that we need to look at.
Pena nganzugi jun she chogu mare ani ta chi mazang loyim la sobare teni chama tsikzu nga khire so chebala soba sama chi chogu maras pena getsu jigin ban chi chogu maras tam tinan pena jun ro jing ban jun she chogu mare yinyan kab da thule teni jun jun didang ti thugi ani goban ilaya gasha da gobal tuni gasha le goba chej yobaina gasha le goba chej yobaina ani jun she na digi yobach o dindi son yores ra.
So for example, lying is a prohibited action. Lying, sexual misconduct, divisive speech, harsh speech, idle chatter, killing, taking what was not given to you, and so forth. All of these actions are prohibited, particularly for the ordained, for novices, for the fully ordained. They are prohibited, and yet in some situations you need to weigh up the prohibition and the necessity of performing one of those actions. Like, for example, with lying. Lying is prohibited, and yet in certain situations there is a purpose, there is a need to tell a lie, which you can say it is stronger than the prohibition.
Tere dinza pena getsu on na tan dewe nangula ya nangwa mebadi pena loyum mazang jotla ya ani nangwa zao ni yo mares the dini so chebala ya kawkola ya nangwa chin shawa tindi jun shebala ya nangwa chin shawa tindi ani muchu na me jun ya nangwa yobaji ni jema sons.
So for example, in the literature of the Vinaya, you find references to permissions that you get for performing certain actions. With respect to sexual misconduct, an act of unchastity, there is never a permission that is given for an ordained person to engage in such an action. But for killing, for example, though killing is a prohibited action, in the Vinaya, there is a reference to when an action of killing is permitted. Also, with respect to lying, there are certain stipulations for when lying is permitted, although in general it is a prohibited action. Now, with respect to telling a big lie, with respect to one's superhuman powers or abilities, which is also something that is prohibited, Geshe hasn't seen before a reference to some cases in which you are permitted to tell a lie pertaining to having supernatural abilities or superhuman abilities.
Teni chang tong ya nang zao ni yo mares.
Also, with respect to drinking alcohol, there are no permissions whatsoever for drinking alcohol.
That the Junzen the Karsana, the Chang Tong ni Mazang Chug Shilaya Shubi, Nyanga Chagayonza, Zabi, and it Tong Pena Mazang Chutavalaya, now Zoni Mevanza, that Chang Tong that new, the same Yora, same Truni, and it Mazang Chug Shilaya Shubi, Nyanga Yovanza, Peshe, now the Kashan do some to Sra.
Now, there weren't any stipulations made with respect to when drinking alcohol is permitted, because Geshe reckons that if it is permitted, then it can lead to the basis for sexual misconduct or actions of unchastity. In that, if you drink and you become inebriated, you can then lack a clarity of mind that will lead to a sexual misconduct.
Hilda on the Nangaki Kabati, Nangaki, Chaviki, Kabata, Shilsabuji, Shindena, and Doi Shonlaya, Tagoyachi, Chagores, Dondo Zavigi, Zavachibi, Tachi, Shon, Retozolia, Sivana, Tangone, Nangaki, Yawadi, and Tamuchin Shintoyachi, same thing, Namu Gobata, Kavi Gobola Soba, Gaja Gubi Kabadi. And same thing call into a Chavana, and it now you're Samsung Tony, and it's Lamsang, now the Kokov land there, Soroji, Chagmares, now the Kokov land, K, the Chong, Hamagoji Kale, now the Kokov Lambana, and Nyanga Chagoras.
So if you're really deeply interested in developing an understanding of what is permitted and what is prohibited, it's good to study the system of the Vinaya, where there's quite a lot of clarifications that are done with respect to at which point in time a certain action is permitted, although in general it is prohibited. So we want to study that not in order to find ways in which we can get permissions to do certain stuff. So it's not that this is what we have in mind. So to find the ways, to use the ways to get permission for doing certain things. It's rather that we want to be able to precisely weigh up a certain course of action when it is permitted and when it is prohibited. Often we don't understand the distinctions between the prohibition and the permission, and then we go about wrongly. We get a mistaken approach with respect to a certain course of action. So in order to be able to have a good appreciation of what is permitted in a certain situation, it's good to look at that system of Vinaya.
Repena, Naumang Chedi, Nebalaya, Nebal Nawadi, and it sola Nyanga Yubi, Natsa Yobana, Nawandi, Jengados, Nawandi Togudos, Timatobi Chitangi, Lulaya, Natsa Tamazangi, Natsa Yungi of Zangi, and it Nawan language Chona, and it Metsekanzalaya, Nazulu Dugdingo Pumboinza, and it Mana Matsa with Twitch, in majors.
So like, for example, with respect to permissions that are given to someone that is sick, the permission for avoiding certain actions is given to a sick person if their condition is a life-threatening condition. So this is not given in general for someone that have a certain ailment or pain or a certain sickness going on. It is referring to a permission to avoid or to do something for someone that that has a life-threatening condition. After all, we need to keep in mind that this aggregate that we have is an aggregate in the nature of suffering. So inevitably, we do feel pain, sickness, and so forth. So simply having that, which is the nature of the aggregate, doesn't mean that you get this special permission. So this is just one example of having to contextualize certain permissions. Permission for the ill, for the sick, are given for life-threatening situations.
Jigdan Garden Song Derwa, Kadim Minuchidercha, Dedel jimbi tütadu, Tsultrim Tanyen Shakwa songs.
So there are a few verses in the section that covers the explanation of actions that are permitted and prohibited actions, verses 42, 43, and 44. Let's begin with verse 42. If in the context of dangers of prayer, you're unable, be as comfortable as you can. In the same vein, at the time of generosity, morality is treated with equanimity, it is taught.
That's an Tamini tende, Javad Lawson, Sishuresha, Rangi Sola Nebin Jigbatans, Kunjola Chobala Sobi, Gadendam, David Chet Halbi Sumjingi Ten Sultan Jevi, Lusum Joba Shindu Tawa, Rangi Muniba Chona, Chidara Chavanandis. Lord Musibishibin Dole, the Del Jimbi to Tsultrim duty, Tanyum Susha souls.
When the commentary explains these points, it begins with the first couple of lines in verse 42. If in the context of dangers of prayer, you're unable, be as comfortable as you can. It says in our commentary, if one is unable to perform certain extremely subtle actions of body and mind at the time of one, danger to one's life, or making offerings to the triple gem with prayers, or actions for the superior purpose of others, then one should put one's mind at ease. From the sutra requested by inexhaustible wisdom, thus at a time of generosity, contain morality and practice equanimity.
She is a Niga Tuchik the munitions, Pena Jimbat Tawadan, Tsultrim Son Ni, Tuchik, Jichik Tundu, Pena and Chik, any Tonsum Ton Jogori, Chik Sonsum Ton Jogodi, Kaukalia, any Gandu Ton, Manuva Tindi, Yonsigris, Tindi Kalia, Pena, any that Chanju Sembigi. Chanjuk Sem Yamslim Kalaya Leton Chigoya, the Mambu Yungoras, Tikalaya, and it's Tsultrim Tamu Germanunaya, Tanyam Shanaya, and the Gobachayoris.
Tanyam Shah di Kabdila Tindo Karina.
Di Macheva Mazamba, Tsultrim Gutania, Mazamba. That Tsultrim Gimintu Shokotra System, Kadejora, Di Macheva Shayat.
For the practice of Bodhisattvas, there are occasions in which you gather a few practices together. Like, for example, there is a time in which, at one time, you practice generosity and ethics, in that you have the intention to give and also the intention to God, the mind that guides. But certain situations occur in which it seems that these two are contradictory. The intention to give or the intention to God could be seen to be contrary. So at this point in time, you need to see, you need to decide what to do. So it might be that you will have the intention to give, and you will be equanimous with respect to ethics. So I asked Geshe, what does it mean to be equanimous with respect to ethics? Well, Geshe said that when you look at fine points or subtle points with respect to the guarding of ethics, you might not attempt to guard the final points or the subtle points. And at that point in time, generosity will be stronger or will be overriding.
Bena Junshedi, Junshebadi, Tsultrim Gumintin Chorwas, Chitang Junshebina, Ani Labalaya, and Kunjagoros. Hinaya, Bena Jimbadi, Jimbalaya, Ani Sansing Jimba, Chuji Jimba, Ani Minjiva Gabi Jimba Sech, Jimamboras. Bena Minjiva Gabi Jimba Slawandi, Shank Sokyoya, Shank Sokyoya di, 민지고 깹지 짐바 들어왔어. 대지디 빼 간다 시작했어. 답변은 아니 미치기 아니 빼나다 지외 소리지. 미완여지기 아니 지우지 빼 아니 세야기 쳐도 빼 슈지 대용지 지우 아니 교용지 간지 빼는 쪽서 얻어지려야 준 대바이나 담매 온여 레네 지우 통송 슬라바이나 지우 대도슬라는 미디 세그라스 다델에 지우 통마송 슬라바이나 통여러스 준러스 이네 디칼레야 아니 파쇼미 속이 쳐도 소주기 지우 통마송 세기 준디 시좀 금면도 쇼인바이나 디따님 샤치니 준디 셰샤바이나 아니 지기어리 러질라고다.
So Shannon is asking, could Geshe explain what these extremely subtle actions might be? So Geshe said no in his explanation. For example, lying is regarded as a prohibited action. It is a negative action. It is contrary to training in ethics. Right. I think that's coming from here. So it is contrary to training in ethics. It is an adverse factor for training in ethical discipline. So suppose that you're practicing generosity, and there are different types of generosity. There is material generosity, generosity of giving the Dhamma, and generosity of giving protection from fear. So suppose that there is someone on a hunt, right, hunting for other living beings, wanting to kill them. Suppose that they're chasing after a bird, attempting to kill it, and the bird takes shelter in a certain place. It is hiding in a certain place, and you know where it is. You've seen that. The person is asking you, have you seen that living being? You know that they're intent on killing that living being, and you tell a lie in order to protect that living being from being killed. So you're, at this point in time, you're practicing generosity of giving protection from fear, but you're also lying. Lying in general is a prohibited action. However, here you suspend or you become equanimous with respect to ethical discipline that prohibits you from telling a lie. There is a greater purpose, you could say, in this point in time to tell a lie. So this is an example of cases where there is a similar situation where ethics and generosity will not go together.
The lamgi korum la keba chene rimchen du zoba chagu tendos karsina dachi jinso pashin tuki rimbati shaundi tangbu jimba songros tangbu jimbi tamze se jimba tsutung soba songros inza ani jimbi nyamnen ti yapu chiyawa ina ani sudam di shitsu buchi yapu chi yontu go sara inza tindile ya korum la keba chene rimchen du zogu tenda tiresta sigi tenda zo di ani lam angi rimba drotsu di korum ngejinchin ro korum ngejinchin roko ya pe masabata nenga chimbuji chagwanza ani gyasi chimbu shiwali sigi kala ya zo lamgi korum le gonu sombaris.
Then it says, this is saying that at a time when one is not able to practice both simultaneously, and it is the time for mainly practicing generosity, then one should practice equanimity and live one subtle practice of morality. The purpose is to be skillful in accomplishing the path sequentially. So, as we said before when we spoke of generosity, the Buddha began the presentation of the perfections with generosity. One of the verses that we've covered from Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way provided the reason for discoursing on generosity first, right? Since sentient beings seek happiness and happiness comes from resources, first off, the Buddha discoursed on giving. So if you practice generosity well, you create a good and solid foundation for morality, for ethics. So in the commentary, it says, this is saying that at a time when one is not able to practice both simultaneously and It is the time for mainly practicing generosity, as after all, generosity was taught first. Then one should practice equanimity and lives one's subtle practice of morality. The purpose is to be skillful in accomplishing the path sequentially, which means that the purpose is to become skillful in the states of the path. You want to ascertain what the states of the path are, to become knowledgeable of how you should progress sequentially, and to know when is the occasion, for example, to first off focus on generosity, so that you create a solid foundation for the practice of ethical discipline. So this is being skillful in the sense of the path.
Jimbal de Tsultrim chodu kirbis. Taji lam chome ki kyabashina Jimbal de Tsultrim chodu kibaris was. Chedar tanyum chashenas. That Jimbi Nyamnen Kalaya Tsultrim Hansitanyum Chagore. Jimbi Nyamnen de Tsultrim Nyamnen chodu kibare was labainas.
The perfections were taught in order, and therefore the point is made in a commentary which says, how can one regard it with equanimity since morality is greater than generosity? So you can say that there is a supremacy of ethical discipline in comparison with generosity. So how can you regard ethical discipline with equanimity if ethics has a supremacy over generosity?
Tirda kanshi samdi charsamba teleshendu musamdi terde payi sambayi tenye rishi drupar chas kanji enin go thambu khan tsomba di tsomni tarchimbaji mache badu yi shen yang de bayina ani chawadi tsomma tuwa chadores chawajik tsomma tuwa cha ni tsomma tuwa sum tsomma tuwa kanzam jilaya kari gochu naina tar makibaji chawaina ani gochu ya de godeme yu chagra wasra kan gotsamba di tar shimbaji cheda dene be ani din jema dia dinaji ngodi jema dinaji ngore roj o disungores.
To answer that question, let's look at the next verse, which is 43. It says, after initiating the intended action, do not think about anything else. For the time being, accomplish that very action with your thoughts focused on it. So you have initiated a certain action. For the time being, as you initiated a certain action, don't go off and initiate another action. If you initiate one action, then you initiate another one. Then before you bring them to completion, you initiate another one. You will develop that habit in which you will be undertaking actions and not bringing them to completion. So what's the point of initiating actions if you're going to behave in this way?
대단한 꼴렉치스 로 젠도 니가 민규로스 시제 많이 니니모 대단한 펠민규스.
And it continues in saying, in this way, all is accomplished well. Otherwise, neither will be accomplished. The secondary afflictions, which are non-introspection, will not increase in this way.
고름 예전도 흡급이 자와 간식이 간식 토머 르 짬디 자와 짬바 텔리 셴도 무sam디 토머 짬비 짐바 텔 이익대비 삼바이 짐바 테니 리식 드버 차디 람라 고름 예전도 흡바 대단한 공 레버시본 규지 젠도나 고름 돈 하시니까 타치모 민규로스.
The commentary says, with respect to that, one does not divert mentally from the first practice in a series that have to be practiced sequentially. Generosity, which has to be practiced first, is practiced alone with a firm mind for the time being. This is to achieve the proper sequence of the path, because if one mistakes the sequence, then one will not achieve the former or the latter.
rimba mishibi shije mayimbi nyewi nimunam lam rimba shindu shiba tedanin pewa mingyubi lamgi korimla kebar chawos.
By knowing and following the steps of the path, by knowing and following the steps of the path, the secondary afflictions, which are not introspection, and which do not know the sequence, will not increase. Hence, one should strive to become proficient in the sequence of the path. So someone was asking, what are the defining characteristics of introspection?
시신기 생이 세우지 테마스터기
데라 센중 나올라 시신기 생이 야마레
시신기 생이
시신 마인데
근데 인규 아니 시신세디 아니 제롱다 마롱기 자와 가리 용구 예메디 응원전 통인디 시신레스.
Well, in the text on monumental factors, there is no definition for introspection. So Geshe says that if you wonder what it is, well, it is the knowledge of the understanding of which action is a suitable action to do and which action is not a suitable action for you to do.
니바 냠바 송발라 니 르기 하바 냠바 송와탄 셈길라바 냠바 송 담보 르기 하바 냠바 송와라 숨 나미 기 온도 마당와탄 데메비 쩌바빵와탄 자와치비치 콜롱기 삼바템바오 담보 나미기 마당와니 제미 땀나 하소타 모서 때문 나마보 콜론 주번기와나 텔라 차바빵와차스.
So we looked at the section of explaining the context for permitted and prohibited actions. Let's look at the second section of the way to train in ethics of refraining from negative actions. We finished covering making effort to purify the conduct of the three doors. Let's look at guarding against all deteriorations. There are a couple of points in this section. Point A comes under the heading of guarding against deterioration in the training of the body. And point B is guarding against deterioration of the training of the mind. Now, when we guard against deterioration in the training of the body, there are 3 points that are made. Not allowing oneself to fall under the sway of distraction, abandoning pointless activities, and examining the motivational thought when acting. Let's begin with verse 45 that comes under the heading of not allowing oneself to fall under the sway of distraction.
야보드 총군기 땀속 재미 땀니 하소보다 노벨레 소비 모습이 때문 남번만 꼴은 주고 메자시 거바 여봉 젠용우 주번 주거나 자와텔라 차바 pombaos.
Verse 45 reads, various types of idle gossip and many great plays, if one becomes involved in any of these, abandon attachment to them. Do not engage in meaningless talk, such as gossip about kings or robbers, and also do not engage in dance or one of the many other kinds of spectacular performances. If there is a purpose, or if it is to harmonize with someone, then one should abandon attachment for the action.
어디다 조디 베나직 애니 쇼메비기 땀 mambu shedeata ani chi rangye shempung ki pita chikeji shedela soba ani ta jigdembi ki ani temon sola soba tabati chedang gajares ro getsun hawdun du getsun chilaya ani ta jung chatok sorochi ro ngakela ya roguyenza digmaris ketsi and machine layer tuni and tagoya soba chona neighbor the telia and susan layer chaba maki was chegures chaba pangures
So the section says, do not engage with actions of, for example, speaking about things that are pointless, speaking about politics of kings and robbers and so forth. Do not engage in performances or things that stir the senses. So it seems that this one is particularly addressing the situation of monastics, coming mainly under the banner of meaningless chatter, right? Not getting involved with meaningless chatter. Now there's a certain social context where you will participate in those activities. So Shantideva says here that if in a certain social context, in order to be harmonious with others, then you need to do that. At least do that without a sense of attachment.
Sorry. The two di Nanzuta Pena Ravjon Pomodojina, the Chitangi, Chapi Nimbo Tenko Ross, Rachabi Nimbo Tendi Pen Nima Rojimbaino, Muduzulomba, Chisaku Sosolaya, Mezicoranaya, Sotigori, Digiori, and Chik Chatan Kesagi, Yultan, Teagi, and Chik Tuzo the new Chagorasra. That Dandi Tuzalia could Turokoran Yoton and Zambali Korajavo Chonape, Dawachis Namle, Korajavo, Mimambu Shujle, Tugori, and the Chadan Kiagi, and Kenda Mambutea, Yungaza, Chadan Kiwi, Kenda Tevikalia, and Susu Chadan Govach Chematuana, and Kujojla Deni, and Tarki Kosadi, Jarumji in the Sungula, deep Peshi, Yoya Majoroch, Kanji. And yen yosajiglaya droni susu juji chadang de kautuana di nimachi chuzuji kautuana di and never shuji teletembi sonum sayari geva sayari shuji lab chejo yosaris.
Looking at time of old, where people remain mainly in their native areas. So they had to get by, they had to provide their own livelihood, but they weren't used to traveling around so much. So there would be less occasions where attachment, anger, and so forth were encountered, in the sense that the conditions for the arisal of such afflictive states of mind were less abundant. But looking at this day and age, it seems that when we have the ability to travel across the world from one place to another in such a short span of time, we can go around the world in a month or less than a month and meet so many people. It seems that there are more and more conditions that we encounter that can give rise to anger and attachment. It makes it so much harder to avoid conditions for anger and attachment and so forth. So an advice that is given with respect to that, like for example, as Jonas has said before, that find a situation where that works for you, where you're more removed from conditions that give rise in your mind to anger, attachment, and so forth. So while such an advice is given, it seems that now looking at the connectivity of the world that we live in, it seems that it's so hard to find such a place that is bereft of conditions for the arisal of anger, attachment, and so forth. Since it is impossible to find a situation where you will not encounter ample conditions for the arising of such afflictive states of mind. So you do your best in doing that. And if you can do that for one day, or if you can do it even for 1 hour, where you avoid those conditions that give rise to your afflictive states of mind, even that becomes a great accumulation of merit. It contributes to a great accumulation of merit.
Pena dua korang nangol yungores pena kawa sambi kalaya ani sanji sheju kalaya chik pena ta chik getsu tomba yong suzoba ani namda somada tuing ingma tadi tulaya ani chik laban hachik somani 아니 개발랍 체존디 닝망가 둔 딘디지라야 라바 나지 소야디 개발랍 체그레스 도 코라는 송여레스 가인스는 디 아니 뒤 딘디지라야 게망부 쇼지 dombi mentu chogi ke mamu shuji yo za tendri chi kile ya ngone so so song to ban ta ani so labo chi zo ro yo di sewre do sra
It is said in the literature of the Vinaya that at time of old, during the fortunate eon when the Buddha was around, there were monks and nuns that were keeping their ethical discipline pure and perfect. We now live at a time of the 5 degenerations. And it is said that keeping even one single bit of ethical discipline at a time of the 5 degenerations becoming rampant is so much more powerful than the guarding of pure discipline in totality during the time of the Buddha. So taking into consideration how hard it is at this day and age, where the 5 degenerations are rampant, how hard it is to guard ethical discipline, it is more powerful even to guard a single ethics than how it used to be before. This is what is stated in the Vinaya.
야보다 총군기 건다 니버 되미 비좁어 보니 되미 사고자 줬다 사른데 소 체결나 대실라버 텐진이 잡이테면로 도르스
Next, verse number 46 is teaching abandoning pointless activities. This verse reads, meaningless digging, cutting of grass, and drawing in dirt. If one does this, upon remembering the trainings of the Tathagata, out of fear, abandon them immediately.
데레 딘자 단두존한지 야부치 단렐하우치다 지단 렐하우레도스 이니안 삼로 담바이나 베 아니 산지 좀 된디기 최된 남기간주 아니 저버 처음에 봐 따왔던 좀 저버 처음에 세디 원니 저버 처음에 봐 임바디 아니 손두스 토니 에 된또 투야도치 그라 차기도스.
So these verses are quite easy, they're quite simple, but then still, when you think about it from the viewpoint of the 2 aspects of the teachings of the Buddha, the aspect of the philosophical view of dependent origination and the practice of non-harmfulness, these verses here mainly focus on non-harmfulness, non-violence. Really, this is what they teach, non-harmfulness.
Pena genhong miya temeba sakowata tsachobata sarindewa so chebangyuna ani deshi gi laba temba chinis chanju sembi laba temba chini nyemik la trabi ki melo torba chawus.
Even if one is not a bhikkhu, fully ordained, when one is engaged in meaningless activities such as digging, cutting grass, drawing in the dirt, and so forth, then one should remember the trainings of the Tathagata and being afraid of the shortcomings of one's actions, stop them right there.
Sumba chawa chebi tse kulungi samba tagbala sum temba da sheba to tendo wa tamba temba ni kansi gyobarn de kyurtam mawarn de ban gyona ya tambo rangi semtani tagbe ribar dembar chas.
And then the next point in the outline, examining the motivation of thought when acting in relation to guarding against deterioration in the trainings of the mind, that consists of 3 points: a brief presentation, extensive explanation, and synopsis. Let's begin with the brief presentation in verse 47. It says, if you wish to move or wish to speak, first analyze your mind and then be smart through steadfastness.
Re da lunga gi zo tirda lunga gi chawa khanda chi yo bayne ya ani lunga gi chawa de la mashu ko ani tambo rangi sem ta ko ya di kichimbure son da namgyung an da yongde tres kulung kichimbure sa di ani kulung la ya ta gor kulung chu gor sa di 된다 찍바래도 왔어요.
Prior to acting with our body and speech, we should inspect our mind. There's a sermon saying that the motivation plays the most important role. Check what your motivation is. This is exactly what is stated here. Prior to acting with your body and speech, look at your mind.
제베는 강기 수이 류겨번 됐담. 되번 겨담. nga mawan deban gyunaya tambo rangi seml tan nibi on the madam tembi judo chedar ribat temper chaos.
The commentary to verse 47 says, at the time when one wishes to move one's body or wishes to speak, one should first investigate one's mind to make sure it has not fallen under the control of the afflictions or self-cherishing, and then engage accordingly in what has to be practiced and what has to be abandoned.
Niba shebala nga nimukin debitse chidar chawata. Goba soji chidar chawa. Ningur soji chidar chawa. Jenda na samit chidar chawa. Chowa do shumba so kien debitse chidar chawa was. Tambu nimukin debitse chidar chawa ni kanse rangi chabata. Chowan deba di tse lesu meja hamaja. Shin shentune never chas.
Now, when we look at the extensive explanation of examining the motivational thought and when acting, there are 5 points. How to act when one wishes for afflictions to arise. How to act when excitement and so forth arise. How to act when you're the recipient of gain and honor. How to act when thinking of others' welfare. And finally, how to act when you wish for fury and discouragement, etc. to arise. Now, let's look at the first point, how to act when one wishes for afflictions to arise. Just a second. I think that kind of, probably a better translation of these points is how to act when your afflictions wish to arise. It's not that you wish for your afflictions wish to arise. So it's probably a better translation. So then verse 48 says, when one's mind wants to be attached or when it wants to be angry, do not move and do not speak, abide like a tree.
Kanze rangi yi chabata chowan deba dizi luigi le su mecha ngaki maa mechawa nimbo song tuba shing shindu neba chawas.
When the mind wishes to get attached or wishes to become angry, do not engage in a physical action and do not speak. Rather, abide like a tree and be able to hold the antidote.
Redadi kabdulaya penachi chabang mondu kubi kabri kondong mondu kubi kab taharana chik nimbo ten sedi nanzolaya komdiji mewana kabu perendo asira kani beti rameba shodroya jimado kaya chik nimik samya chik kaburo asinda ta gyundengi ngi samna ta gyundengi pigilaya ani chabe nimik re kondri nimik re indi des chik sam tungingi mijigi ani chabodan kondri kiro chiwe kalaya tende ani katuya chik ra yongsares.
How hard it is to apply the antidote to anger or to attachment when they're already present. We know that based upon a personal experience, that when they're already there, due to a lack of familiarity with applying an antidote, we find it difficult to apply it. So an approach to that would be to continuously and regularly remind ourselves of the faults of the afflictions, how anger is faulty, how attachment is faulty. If we get used to think of the drawbacks of the afflictions, our ability to apply antidotes to them when they arise is going to grow bigger and stronger.
Timando benatachik deshaki kondruki yan the typical chik ngun tangbani nganzo chik big chushe dingin so ngena kondru sayang ninga dosra
So looking at the conditions for anger or the condition for attachment and so forth, we encounter those conditions, and it is not unlikely that a certain condition can cause us even to get angry at the person that teaches us the Dharma.
Nipa goba soji tse chidar chawanis, goyatan kashir chebam kade ngajit, gyar dembam, sangruwaye sambatan, kade kyunjin husimsim, kanse dagdol hulemba, jana mimba nidani, shechi gedan chi kyurpa, tetsi shinjen nebar chas.
The next point is how to act when excitement and so forth arise. There are 2 verses here. Having mental excitement while mocking, having pride or conceit, or thinking about criticizing, being cunning or thinking about deceit, when being ready to praise oneself and belittle others, telling others off or being argumentative, then one should remain like a piece of wood.
Yunla chawe gobatan, shegi ji chokchewe kasha chebam, kade yondingi kimbi ngargiltan, langso soji gyabatan dembam, shengi tsangchwe sambatan, kade kyunjin chok mishibi, ketsuwatan, yogu shenlo sembam, semsim, kangi tse yondinjibi goni, dakto lembam, kyunjibi shenla mimba nidani, kowantibi shewada cheba, zöjin gyabada chiban gyaba tizi nimbo rangya tuba muyowa shi jindu nebar chawos.
The commentary to this section says, at these times one should remain like a piece of wood while being self-supportive with the antidote. When there is the mental excitement of mocking the object, when belittling others with jokes, when full of pride due to qualities, when being conceited due to youth and other reasons, when thinking about criticizing others, when one is cunning and wants profit out of dissatisfaction, when one thinks about deceiving others with pretension and dishonesty, when one praises oneself wholeheartedly by expressing one's qualities and puts others down by mentioning their faults, when scolding others and being argumentative and quarreling. Shall we leave it here for now?
Excuse me, can I just ask a couple of questions?
To your turn.
When it comes to, say for instance, lying.
When it comes to
lying and there's reasons that you can lie,
yeah.
Would that be in the case of, say, somebody's very ill and you want to console them by their belief? So if they're Christian, you could say, look, don't worry, you'll probably go to heaven, and think of all that sort of stuff, even though we're aware not actually in heaven. But I guess it could be a grey area of, it could be a gold realm, so could sort of get by with that. So they aren't fearful at death, even though it might not be the case of where they might end up. And also, is that also in the context of, say for instance, His Holiness says he's just a simple monk, where in fact he, in my mind, probably other people's minds, he's the Buddha, but he might not want to say that because that's with pride, which he wouldn't have, and also for the fact that then we would think he's omniscient and then freak out about our afflicted states of mind in comparison. And also with another point of taking yourself away from situations that are going to bring up afflictions. Sometimes I get it that it's good to be away from those situations, so you can train your mind. but it also believes that, like that verse, you know, there's nothing whatsoever is not made easier through acquaintance. So becoming acquainted with smaller harms, I should learn patiently to accept greater harms, which lovely Geshe Tsultrim told me a long time ago, so I still say that. Touch wood that I'll continue. And so when you're in difficult situations, it's the perfect time to try and practice. Even though it is difficult, I find if I take myself totally away from situations, it just makes those situations all that much harder. Whereas they do actually become easier if I'm braver. Sorry, a lot that all those thoughts are coming out.
All right. So I'm wondering if people at home heard that. If I have to repeat that, it's rather long. Do I need to repeat that?
It's all right, Hudson. We heard that one. Heard all of that.
All right. Maitreya also heard that, so that's good. Thank you. 지난번에 그 강선 셰 미쳐나야는데 갑자기 나와요 레슨을 지 사스도. 페나 쿠란 페나 산삼미 시 join la 강선 셰고 기로. 페나 계시 시 join 데 넘버바이나 지텐고 바볼라 히치 담 태바요나. 니 ngotso number imbe chane console lopso chi gyawaina. 페나 디 Shigo imare, Sinanshe yomare, Kuran Tron Sane, Hakuncho, Jegires, then the not so the Hakuncho Mena yomare, Sheshin to Consola Galzon, then the Shina Tigeres, the Yamena Garim Pache, Nangyun, Tarakimains, then the Sungirwa, Gelung Kimains and Sungirwa. That the Garim Pache Sangire. 아니 단체기엠바 제스 아니 나츠 녀몬 칸단 칸 이어바디 킹기레스 이네 타와키마 인스나얀데 미덴바 라나 디그라와스 제선덴데 치 네서 다가란데레스 디 치와 담보 치체 다 니바디라 키랑기 단 녀몽 깨베기 깬스도아 아니 깬디 마체기 체도 사실 셈발라 데와이나 파도아이나 찬사야보의 레스 셰도아 이네 짠짠 녀몽 체나마 또 님보 땅땅 디 야기 야보 야마나 야로 조기 말해서 까까블라 덴데 믹세기 녀몽 깨베기 Kendi sacha chi yamne kemman bochegi sacha dila deoina yan nyamnyo nyamne yage dogi resa
단다 여름지기 mambu sungdos yodangan ngachda lenking dojros lama khoma sogi ani chomde karson de teletes jang dima mele lenki yaga penru so karson dimela lenki jeroji karson de na lenking dojres tamudijla daga
de kanana ge yamne
ngachda lenking dojros.
Well, Geshe said that, here is acting often as a messenger, like this is what his honor says, this is what the Buddha said, this is what the great masters of the past have said, this is what the Nalanda masters have said. So in that sense, often Geshe is acting as a messenger.
Tinza yavrumji khalsung duslana lagdon du tinzanla chik susu gi phamini yebi chuigin telaya and chik 대바 당한 슈첨부 영예수 디 지부 잡 고야시기 잡니 갑둘이야 펜토 여바치 차에 카부레스 디제 다가랑 제바이나 야가 요레스 마무송송스 인정 간다지 다군조 등이리 간등이 코란수 이게 코란수 비기래야 아니 제바이어서 아니 지 셈테사들이야 그 가리어는 디토는 드로치바이나
So his honor has said before that those that have a certain spiritual affiliation that is quite strong with their cultural conditioning. Like, for example, they were born into a certain background, into a certain spiritual tradition. So if they have strong inclination towards their background, then if we insist on leading them somewhere else, it's not going to work out for them. That's not going to be the best approach to them. So sometimes with those people, if you just stick with their affiliation, with their affinity, then you can help them better. So this is one advice that His Holiness gives.
That just so gipigila ya pena da nanchu tindi tep tindi je lama tindi den che and nanchu len deva yon so and rawang toni pigila ya ti che deva yoba dela anganzu roba chigo ya di pekichimburos.
Or if they express some interest in Buddhist texts or books or some advice, and they have a certain freedom to seek for that, and they're asking us to help them out, then we can proceed in doing that.
Teni jawarumjigi taukyumachik inson ya di nganzu nangula ya jawarumche nganzu dushi jawandigi and sanjiri chene sikre se chik kani labdar modo ngondi nganzu tonso di ani nganzu nanshingi miji madobigi mixegi pen cheri si chashi hotago chapon chendo tindiji nganzu jega modo as jawarumji koran kang somba dara nganzu tongo as.
Now, with respect to His Holiness being saying that he's a simple monk, well, the way that we think and the way that we express ourselves, we say that His Holiness is Buddha, His Holiness is Chenrezig. We say that, although what appears to our senses, but the aspect that appears to our senses is just of an ordinary being. It's not that we see His Holiness as Chenrezig with 1,000 arms and 1,000 eyes. This is not the aspect that appears to us when we see His Holiness. What appears to us is an aspect of an ordinary person. Someone mentioned in the previous session of the Lamrim that His Holiness is like us, is getting sick, is getting older, and so forth. So then, relative to our perspective, His Holiness is not telling a lie. Actually, it is true. What he's saying, when he's saying that I'm a simple monk, it is true relative to our perspective.
nganzu chik mikima nangshi mayimba chik pheba ina nganzu je kor tu mares nganzu yaru ji sonju ko shu tu mares nganzu je tu mare son ko mare kun je mare tenza ani goba nganzu la sichin awa chere sigi ani nganzu ta wi ta chik mi nambala chambati su semtin icheta teba tindi jiwa ina ani chere sigi chendabdi juk tu yores ra.
So had His Holiness appeared to us in a different aspect, having a different appearance, we would not be able to see him, we would not be able to interact with him, we would not be able to hear him, we would not be able to receive teachings from him, we would not be able to interact with someone that does not appear to us in that aspect. We would not, had he appeared to us in the aspect of Chenrezig, we would not have been able to see that, to interact with us. So, therefore, he appears to us in a way that we can relate to. So, therefore, it is permissible then to adopt the mental attitude that though the appearance is of a simple monk, is in actual fact Chenrezig. In actual fact is an enlightened being.
Shivshenga digi Geshe kalaya nanzuchi tandi chalaya chodosaji yib jasachi mundoas tenza nanzuchi zojina dechin suzu samsung tu yagi tabshi chigoyadi and kicheshu redose ngidinichi loving samsungs.
Now, with respect to what Geshe said previously, with respect to verse 45, well, looking at the condition for the afflictions, often we don't have other places to go. Actually, Geshe has said before, things he said before, that it's better to stay here, for example, in this center and just guard your mind. So rather than kind of living and going somewhere else, it's actually good to stay in an environment like that and just work on guarding your mind.
지당게 다 탑시 딘지 라 소소소게 감다 메발 때니치 내가 비리라 메다 딘지레 만테바 사지는 존이 펜도 영에 조이나 안도스 페나 공 힌기어 담바도 딘지 페고레 만조도 세나 디고라스 이네 원니게 직 템슈디 고겐 요사지려야 가겐 요사지려야 로치니 가겐들이야 동니치 투와나 다 템부슈치
If you find yourself in a certain disposition where it suits your disposition to go somewhere else where you are more isolated from conditions that would otherwise give rise to your afflictions, then you can do that. This is also something that was emphasized by the great masters of the past. So you can do that, and still something that is even more effective than that is to remain in a place where you have conditions for the afflictions arising, and still to work in order to prevent your afflictions from arising, to make more effort in doing that. That will be even more powerful than living and going somewhere else. Thank you. Gewadi Yududa Lama Sange Yude Goa Chika Malupa De Salagopa Shu Chanchu Sancho Rinpoche Maki Panu Kegyu Yapana Yapana Gole Kowe Shinkandu Denda Dewa Malu Juwe Chere Siwan Desiga Son Shape Siti Bandu Thank you. Yahweh dance, Yahweh Kozo Lupo, Chosun Kowe, Lazo Luji Kondo Shabdi Sho.
Thank you, Geshe-la. Thank you, Kat.
Thank you, Reverend Carson.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Ah.